Welcome back to Gulf Streams. This week, we're talking about social practice and eco-art with an artist whose work truly challenges us to imagine a better future, Jackie Sumell. You may know her from her incredible long-running projects like Solitary Gardens or The House That Herman Built, where she uses collaborative art and gardening to transform spaces of isolation and advocate for prison abolition. Her work doesn't just ask questions, it plants seeds, literally, for healing justice. Now, Jackie is bringing her radical form of collaborative art making right here to Houston. Her newest installation is on the Rice University campus. It's called Endangered Feces, and it's provocative, but very important. Working with students in the community, she's creating decomposable sculptures modeled after the scat of local endangered animals like the Houston toad and the Atwater's prairie chicken. These organic sculptures, embedded with native seeds, will naturally break down in the Harris Gully Natural Area, actively helping to restore the habitat right where they stand. It's a timely call for interdependence and a reminder that we're all connected, from the smallest toad to the soil beneath our feet. Join us as we explore how to work toward a collective and flourishing future. I'm Cheney Hill, an instructor in the Environmental Studies Department at Rice University, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. And now let's welcome Jackie Sumell to the program. So to get us started, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. I'm Jackie Sumell. I'm an artist and organizer, abolitionist who's based in New Orleans, Louisiana. Most of the work that I've done the last now 25 years has been organized around illustrating the inhumanity of solitary confinement in collaboration with folks who are currently incarcerated. And that work has many different evolutions and revolutions and ways of expressing itself that have led me ultimately to the project that I did here in collaboration with the Moody Arts Center.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, can you tell us maybe a little bit specifically about, I know two of the projects that I know you best from. One is Solitary Gardens, and the other, which is related, is the House That Herman Built is the name? Or And can you just walk us through a little bit the process of those? Because I think for a lot of listeners, probably when they think of prison abolition, the first place their brain goes is not environmental work.
Yeah.
And I think that the way that you marry these two is really fascinating and really well shown by the work of those earlier projects that take you into this much more explicit kind of environmental project we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. I'd be happy to talk about those. And just to acknowledge at the top of this conversation, the direct correlation between folks who are harmed by the far reach of the prison industrial complex and by environmental racism. And so it makes sense that there is overlap in those conversations and the kind of work that I do. But, the House that Herman Built, also known as Herman's House, was a project that really launched the direction of social practice and collaborative art making. In 2001, I met a man, Herman Wallace, who had then was on his 29th year of solitary confinement in Angola prison in Louisiana. I was 29 years old. And I began writing him, had never written anyone who was incarcerated before, had no idea what I was doing, no expectations, just thought this was atrocious and could not believe that they kept human beings in 6 foot by 9 foot cells made out of concrete and steel a minimum of 23 hours a day. And at this point in my life, just as a juxtaposition, I'm on a full ride with stipend to make art at Stanford University. And the absurdity of these two realities created a tension that really motivated me to explore what power I had as an artist. Yeah. And so, long story tolerable, I asked Herman what kind of house he dreamt of after and then spending 29 years, ultimately 41, in solitary confinement. And he imagined and dreamed this home that I designed, using CAD video, using my skills, So like a mini architectural version of it. There was, a fly-through video. There were all these different ways, but I always juxtaposed it to a cell, his 6 foot by 9 foot by 12 foot high cell that I would rebuild. And so, after 12 years of this exhibition, which became a book, which became a documentary film, Herman Wallace's conviction was ultimately overturned October 1st, 2013. He came home and he joined the ancestors October 4th, 2013. So after 3 days of physical freedom, at this point I'm living in Louisiana, to be closer to Herman and advocate on behalf of his liberation. Of course, I have, Albert Woodfox and other folks who are still incarcerated that I'm working on behalf of. But it was a very confounding experience to have, the raison d'etre that you are in Louisiana, join the ancestors. And, I was just fortunate that we had corresponded for so many years. And I went back and read all his letters and his descriptions of the house and how much this man had talked about gardens and plants and flowers. And when I first asked him, what kind of house do you dream of? He said, I can clearly see the gardens. And they'll be full of gloxinias, delphiniums, and roses. And I wish for guests to be able to smile and walk through gardens all year round. And, just to pause for a moment and think about how much power is in that desire for someone to be starved of a relationship to the natural world, and then that be the first thing they ask for. As a Black Panther, as a political prisoner, here is a man who is committed and recognizes the power of gardens, of the natural world, to help folks who visit smile, And as we amended the house and changed it around, he said, I want a greenhouse because I want folks to be able to engage with flowers and plants all year round. He wanted it made out of wood. Because concrete and steel stifles growth. And in fact, multiple times I would visit him and he would make me these incredible paper flowers that he was deprived of all dignity and access to supplies. And he would color white printer paper on both sides with colored pencils until it took on the color of the flower he wanted. He sharpened his thumbnail and created a pattern to cut out the petals of these flowers. And he would use a mixture of toothpaste and water to create a kind of glue, and that he would wrap overnight with dental floss so it had texture to it. And they are like my greatest treasure. And so Herman's commitment to the natural world was really the motivation for the solitary gardens, So I'm confounded, I'm grieving, I'm confused. Why am I in Louisiana? And I'm rereading these letters and remembering how much this man talked about gardens. And then I'm like, oh, there must be a way to uphold his life and legacy through gardens, but I'm not a grower at this point. I'm like a builder and an artist and an organizer, a lot of things, good friend,
but not a grower.
But not a grower. How am I going to do this, And I just experimented and started experimenting with garden beds that were 6 by 9. And each one evolved into another process, and that became the solitary gardens, which are 6 foot by 9 foot. And then delineated are the bed, the toilet sink, the desk, and the bench. And then we collaborate. We write folks who are still incarcerated in solitary confinement and ask them to curate the garden in the negative space. So the only place the human being can move is where the plants can grow. And that's the genesis of the solitary gardens. But I think critical to your question, Weston, is that, the solitary gardens are made out of something called revolutionary mortar, which, again, is something that I just kind of made up or experimented with until it worked. And revolutionary mortar is made out of sugarcane, cotton, tobacco, and natural hydraulic lime. And so through this rammed earth process, we're building prison cells turned garden beds out of the largest chattel crops, out of the largest forced labor crops, to illustrate the evolution or renaming of chattel slavery into mass incarceration. And in that process, I discovered that revolutionary mortar was alive. And sometimes the sugarcane or the cotton would grow out of the prison walls and crack them. And it was so poetic. And you know, it's like a lot of play and experimentation in the process of making this. And we're really, you know, as an abolitionist, I'm asking folks to imagine a landscape without prisons. So what does it mean to see, you know, the prison architecture dominated by the natural world? What does that say to our, you know, psyches and implicit and explicit biases? And how can that transform our the possibility of actually seeing a landscape without prisons? And so I use a form for the project here with the Moody Art Center, which is an adaptation of the revolutionary mortar. So it's using the non-hydraulic lime and then organic materials and river sand to create sculptures that are temporary and alive and will change over time.
Yeah, and I can see some of that change already. Some of my, for the listeners here, some of my students actually went and got the opportunity to help Jackie and others kind of put together some of this mortar and pack down some of the
Before we get too far down the weeds here, maybe we just name the project.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit
What
about...
did they pack, Cheney? What did they pack?
They packed endangered species feces. Endangered. Oh, no species?
No species.
No.
Species. Just endangered feces.
Yep. Dad joke. It's a
lots
dad joke.
They loved it. Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how this project came about, in addition to the feces?
Yeah. I'd love to talk about it. The project came about, you know, I've been I joke about this, but it is true. I've been courting rice for the last 3 years, mostly with Natasha.
Natasha Bowden, who's a professor of art here.
Amazing human being, human doing, and an artist. And so Natasha invited me to do something like 3 years ago. And that something evolved into something else, evolved into a friendship and, you know, a lot of other possibilities. And I think... And then from that, the Moody asked me if I would be interested in doing a platform project, which is like an outdoor activation. Outdoor could be installation or sculpture. And I said, sure, that sounds awesome. I love an excuse to come to Houston and eat some good Indian food. And so then they just gave me this space to figure out what I wanted to do. And I remember we were driving around on a golf cart. And I had an idea to do something related to solitary gardens, but wasn't really sure what it was. Because I had done a couple of activations prior to called the Abolitionist Tea Party, you know, which is like a very direct outgrowth of solitary gardens, where we're meeting plants through the menstruum of tea that are grown in solitary gardens across the country. And so learning about the ways that plants teach us about prison abolition and ultimately to be better people. And so, you know, so it was like from the Abolitionist Tea Party, it was like, what kind of gardens can Jackie grow here that would make sense, and talk about maybe the history of colonization of this land. And we're driving around on this golf cart, which is also absurd. And then I'm like, there's so many different owl sculptures. Like, what kind of owl is y'all's mascot? And nobody knew. Everyone had a different owl. And so then I was like, there's something weird about not knowing which kind of owl it is and having all these different owls. Like, they physically look different. So then I was like researching what kind of owls are here, and then was like, oh, there's one owl that's actually making another owl endangered. And it's like, one is really, you know, well adapted. I think it's the barn owl that is like, you know, they're now talking about allowing people to kill this owl because it's making extinct, I think they're called ground owls.
Yeah.
And they're really opportunistic, and they can like live in developed and urban areas. And so, you know, the crises of like urbanization against like the natural world, this owl's like, I got this, you know? And then I'm like, so is that the rice owl? And like, does that say something about the school itself and its expansiveness? And then, you know, and I'm like, what other species are endangered? And then just like started looking at all of it. And then, you know, I often think of my practice as a series of downloads. So I was looking at endangered species, and somehow the word feces downloaded, and I was like, okay, it's endangered feces. We'll figure this out. And then it was like, oh, the revolutionary mortar would be amazing for this. And so what we did is we chose 2 endangered species that are endemic or indigenous to this area, the Houston toad and the Atwater's prairie chicken, and then worked with folks like yourself or Cassidy
Johnson over in Bioscience.
Yes, amazing human. And then
longtime conservationist here in Houston.
Incredible person, also so hype about the toad.
She does love the toads a lot.
She loves the toads. So Cassidy Johnson, and then we brought some folks in from the Atwater Prairie Chicken Preserve, and they talked to us while we were making these sculptures, the scat sculptures, which are impregnated with the seeds of the plants that would survive the species. So in the case of the human toad, of the Houston toad, who is an insectivore, so those toads only eat insects. And sometimes smaller frogs or salamanders, but not plants. We chose the plants that would be part of its natural environment. Mm-hmm. And then in the case of the Atwater's prairie chicken, I think this is like very poetic. They brought the seeds to us from the preserve. And they're seeds that the prairie chicken would eat and or live in and or lay their eggs in. So... Mm-hmm.
And then, so can you talk to us a little bit about, so we have an idea of what the project is and what the conception of it, but like, where is it? What does it look like? What can a person's experience be like when they approach these feces?
Well, there's a humor to it that is like obvious,
Mm-hmm.
Like I call it the dad joke. But then there's also a solutionist logic, because as these sculptures break down, they create these little micro climates or little ecosystems that are also educational. But when you're rocking up on the sculptures today, you see 2 giant turds. And they're on the edge of the gully. I can't remember the name of the gully right now. Harris Gully.
Yeah.
And so they're right there on the edge of the gully. And so the backdrop are these like gorgeous native plant species, where a lot of folks, we were just out there today and there was a bunch of bird watchers looking for the smallest hummingbird in the colonized United. Yes, the calliope hummingbird.
Yeah.
And there's 2 big hawks, and they were so worried that the hawks were also looking for the calliope hummingbird, So there's this conversation that's happening with folks who are environmentally curious. And where they're like, the bird watchers came out like, what are these? And I got to say, well, these are endangered feces. And then talk about the project, talk about the toad, talk about the chicken. And then also, like I said, this solutionist logic is like, how can other people learn from these sculptures and this practice to like create micro ecosystems in their front lawns, their backyards, in the ways that they're growing plants in the Houston area to also be supportive to endangered species. And the third one, our budget was pretty small, but we did attempt to make 3, and the third one was the auto skipper, which is a butterfly. And one thing I think is really nice about that is like that seems much more accessible than creating like an ephemeral pond for Houston toad or the Atwater's prairie chicken. One of the things that is making it or that has made it go extinct is that it needs place to run. It needs like prairie grasslands to lay its eggs. Like its egg laying strategy is to lay as many eggs as it can in as many different places, and they don't like to be domesticated, which I think is so poetic and beautiful. And so we thought that the butterfly or the auto skipper would be a really accessible one, and folks could transform their gardens or, like I said, their lawns especially into sanctuaries for these animals.
So I just want to pause for a moment and say, so we have these 3 sculptures.
Two.
Two. So we just wound up with 2 of feces.
Yeah.
Made with the revolutionary mortar that you've told us about, which is both, kind of designed to decompose, but also in this case, you've been really strategic in the seeds you've put in that mortar. And so as it spreads out, as it rains on, we create, as you mentioned, these microclimates. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the research and some of the plants maybe that go in specifically to thinking about generating a microclimate? Because this is, and I think this is an interesting point, which we'll get to a little more, but the amount of science that you're talking about, the amount of conservation work you're thinking about in terms of this art project is really, I think for a lot of folks who, it's easy to have a kind of conception of art as serving purely an aesthetic function, right? And you're pushing an educational mission here, you're pushing an ecological mission here through the artwork itself. And so I love getting to highlight what does this actually entail in creating a microclimate, because it's really sophisticated thinking to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the reason why we chose to put it on the edge of the Harris Gully is because there's already an environmental relationship there, and there's cross-pollination. And Cassidy Johnson was really the person that made that decision or made that call. Originally, we were thinking about other places on campus, and then it was like, if we really want these guys to do what they say they're going to do, we have to put them in relationship to an existing ecosystem. And my understanding is like the construction that's happening there is to actually put in a pond, which would invite more Houston toads, the possibility of more Houston toads.
So, I mean, it's interesting even just thinking about that, because you had mentioned this as almost an aspirational project for folks who might want to duplicate elements of it in their own spaces. You're thinking about not only where is it appropriate on a campus, where does it make sense for the broader kind of campus map, but very much in relation to this is expanding a natural area already, that we're taking what exists and we're magnifying it, which I think is really important because you're leveraging what exists. And this is something that, when I talk to conservationists, often one of the things they point to in that kind of front and backyard project that you're mentioning is thinking of creating networked and island, effects where you kind of build on each other. And so it's interesting to hear you think about which species can be best served and where, and how to enhance what already exists.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that, because it is something I thought about, like whether or not it's like, it's not, irresponsible is not the word that I'm looking for right now, but like, kind of reckless or unnecessary to be asking folks to transform their lawns. Like, does that actually do anything? And the answer is yes. I think there is like there's a cultural movement, first of all. It's like recycling, right? It's like, does recycling actually do anything? The answer is yes. You can make the argument that people aren't actually recycling. These recycling companies are fake, yada, yada, all the things you want. But it's like the fact that, like, as a young person, my mom was like, we're going to recycle because we care about the earth, right? It's like, we're going to transform our lawn because we care about the planet. And then that becoming a cultural contagion that continues on until you have these networks where, it's like the butterfly can go from house to house, or the toad, or the whatever, and they're educational. So you're learning about what plants were here before your house, before this road, before this giant university. And I do think those conversations are important if we're thinking about the ecological crises that we have co-created, and those conversations. I don't have the solutions. As an abolitionist, I've learned this very early. It's like, I'm not telling you how to be an abolitionist. I'm asking you to ask questions around abolition. And I'm not telling you how to save the planet. I'm asking us to come together and ask these questions, to recognize that harm has been done and that these solutions are held within, the history of the plants that have made this planet possible in the first place. Yeah.
So, I mentioned earlier, because I got so very excited that my students and I, came in and kind of sat in one day and helped create the mortar. And there's a whole process to how the mortar itself, this revolutionary mortar, is created, and then how you went about actually kind of putting that in these molds that you developed. So I was hoping that you could talk just a little bit more about that process, what went into it, and in particular, like, this was it's a public installation that people can kind of come across, but you also meant it to be created in kind of a collaborative way as well, which seems to be a large part of your art practice.
Yeah. So that that's called a social practice. So like, some people are painters, some people are sculptors, some people are, fabric artists, or, there's like a million ways to make art. And so the sort of genre of work that I have been engaged with for the last 2.5 decades is called social practice. There's a long history of this kind of making. And collaboration is the fuel for that. And so as you were asking earlier, Weston, the collaboration is direct in making the sculptures, but also the folks that I work with to do the research and like the magic of having someone from the Atwaters Prairie Chicken Preserve come and talk about how much she loves these birds and talk about, like, she was just so lit up and excited to share the seeds directly from the land that is like preserving these animals, and then share her experience with them. And then, this really wonderful thing happened where she said, Jackie, I think this sculpture and this project is so wonderful, and I'm not sure where my place is, but I want to tell you that usually the birds' poop is much more watery than the sculpture. And I was like, great. So I get to make like a pile of diarrhea. And she was like, yes. And then I was like, my life is so great right now. And then she went on to explain, like, how the Atwater Prairie Chicken has 2 different like digestive systems. And one is a cecal pouch that helps to digest proteins, which come out as cecal tar, much more liquidy. And then the other is the pellet, which is like the kind of traditional chicken poop that we would see in a chicken coop and whatnot. It's actually a grouse, but they're related. And so we finished the sculpture, and then Todd and I from the Moody Center for the Arts got to just make a big pile of cecal tar around the sculpture that you and the students helped make.
Yeah.
Which was really fun.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to highlight for a second, because I was hoping we would get to talking through social practice a little bit and thinking about, your kind of background as an artist in particular there, because I think it's really compelling, especially we talk a lot about art and environmental art on this program. We've had a number of folks on before. But as you're hinting at, right, it's the collaboration with scientists. It's, it's thinking about, I will acknowledge, I don't know anything about 2-stomached animals. It's not my wheelhouse. It's not something I'm, really considering. And even in my backyard gardening, which is usually very like, ooh, I saw a butterfly. And like, on one hand, that is fun. On the other hand, like, I genuinely have seen a butterfly every day in my yard, if not several, for the last 6 months, because I tore up a big chunk of it and put in things that I thought would attract them. And I think there's something to that community impact. You called it almost like that kind of cultural contagion of moving around, bringing people into this work. But also, as you hinted at, the real historical component, the real kind of interdisciplinary element, thinking about, as you mentioned, sugarcane and cotton, right? Thinking about the material histories of the various material that you use to create art. All of this gets wrapped up in what art can do and the way that art can tell stories and bring us to the table and educate and motivate. And so I'm wondering if you want to talk about, what you think is uniquely powerful about this kind of praxis, about this kind of work, especially for these really hard, challenging questions, right? When we're thinking about major cultural, social, political hurdles, that I think this is a really fascinating space that you are carving out, especially in that I'm inviting you to ask questions kind of space. So can you talk a little more just about the value of this approach in addressing big things like climate and environment?
Sure. I can't talk about the value of this approach without talking about the folks that I've learned it from.
Please.
Like Mel Chin, and Joseph
great Houston
Boyce.
artist, yeah.
Yeah. And so like artists whose approach has been to ask questions and to, I think of social practice as kind of the antidote to this false narrative of rugged individualism, which is part of racial capitalism. It's this idea that I'm receiving downloads and they're heightened when I'm in collaboration with others. I'm not putting my name, like I am this like amazing artist. Like amazing art happens for sure. And it's just wonderful to share in that process, and complicated, with others. And the collaboration is not explicit with humankind, The collaboration is with the butterflies. It is with the salamanders that are living on the sculptures. It is with the plants that are growing out of it. And so much of my work in general is really like asking the plants to show me how to be a better person. And, and sometimes the answers are like, just like this. Do this differently, lady. And sometimes it's much more subtle and just requires like a deeper relationship. And that is something that, can be applied in the garden, but can be applied with each other. I think should be, is in the end, it's like these relationships that we're building and sustaining are what will survive us, and especially in the current political climate. Yeah.
You mentioned non-human collaboration. So, I mean, obviously the Houston toad, the prairie atwater chicken, but what other non-human collaboration have you had in this project thus far?
I mean, I think I just mentioned that, when I've gone out to visit the sculptures, there's like there's been a couple of like salamanders that are chilling on it. The two hawks, I don't know if hawks are like forever friends or monogamous birds, but there's like two hawks that are always together and they just hang out above the sculpture.
They do.
And that makes me wonder like if the sculptures are attracting like smaller rodents or something like that, and the hawks are just like, benefiting from that. I'm not sure. And then of course the plants. Like I just am so hyped to rock up and see a couple of partridge peas growing out of the sculptures, or the ways that like I think anyone who's paying attention to the fate of the world right now, we can limit it to the relationship to what's happening environmentally, but we obviously do not have to do that, right? Anyone who's paying slight attention is depleted and exhausted and overwhelmed as a baseline. And then I feel that, times 1,000, because I work with folks who are incarcerated. Like whatever we're experiencing that is painful and brutal and negative, folks who are incarcerated are experiencing that, infinitely, much worse. And so, many of my beloveds are still incarcerated, and I'm exhausted, and I'm just like not sure what to do and depleted. And I put a little tiny seed in the ground, and then boop, it grows, and it's like, no, there's possibility, and that's such an important reminder, is like in these moments of like, I have no idea where to go. And you don't always have to know, but you have to remember that something is possible.
I want to ask, I think that's one of the kind of constant pieces of advice we do here and frankly give on the program is, that especially for those who are feeling overwhelmed by environmental challenges, by climate change, that, one of the ways to remedy that even momentarily is just to feel like you're involved in some way, to do some kind of tangible act of care. That's something that does come up a lot, but something that your work in particular draws my eye to, especially with these really difficult topics, these draining topics that you're engaging with, working on, actively trying to, think through, what is the role of humor there? Because at the end of the day, you did create two giant poops.
That's right.
It is quite funny.
It's hilarious. And that levity, I think, is a superpower. Yeah. To be able to express and experience and share in laughter and joy and silliness is an incredible juxtaposition against the seriousness of where we are in the world, and I think that is triumph. And I didn't make that up. That's not my like theory, or what did my friend call it? Joie de vivre. I learned that from Herman Wallace. I learned that from a man who was kept in a 6-foot by 9-foot cell, a minimum of 23 hours a day for 41 unnatural years of his life. And he was funny, and he was playful, and he would clown with me every time I went to visit him, And that kind of spirit is something I feel responsible to carry forward. And so, I grew up in a family that was hilarious and violent. And we transmuted and alchemized so much of the violence with humor. My brothers and I survived it with humor. Mm-hmm. And I do know that there is a superpower there, you know? So I was naturally drawn to Herman because he was funny, you know, because he was silly. And, you know, in theory, I can look at it and say it's X, Y, Z. It's because of what I just described. But there's also just a magnetism. We like to be around funny people. We like to watch them. We like funny movies, you know. Humor is a part of our DNA, you know. And to be able to find that humor and cultivate it in the face of fascism is gorgeous. Yeah.
And I mean, I think, you know, earlier you were talking about how people can learn from the practices that you're doing, and humor being perhaps one of these practices. And so I'm just wondering if you have any experiences that you can share of people who have come across, I mean, you've mentioned a few of the birders this morning who are like, what are these, right?
Yeah.
But have you had any other experiences as you've been developing this project of similar kind of moments of hilarity or joy that you could share?
I mean, I don't live here, so I'm not engaging with folks who are stumbling upon the sculptures themselves. But in the process of building them, you know, being with folks who you may assume have never talked about poop in public, and they have to, you know, now discuss feces, and the kind of like sometimes awkward tension that becomes hilarity has been a real joy for me. And, you know, for the opening tonight, we're going to make seed bombs based on the scat of the endangered feces, so of the endangered species. So we're going to make tiny endangered feces. And one of the curators said, well, you know, we do have patrons who would love to take one of the seed bombs home, but won't actually make a small turd. You know? It's great.
Yeah.
It's like a great conversation. And like I said, you know, when I was working with Todd, who was an absolute delight on building the sculptures and like opening up these molds. And then I was like, and now we get to make some diarrhea. Cha-cha-cha. You know, and the it's just like, and, you know, just to work with Todd, who's installed, I don't know, infinite amounts of exhibitions. And he's like, I've never had this conversation come up before. Like, what shape should the diarrhea be? You know, whatever. And there's just joy in that. It's absurd. It's absurd.
Are you going to tell the people who come tonight when they're making these seed bombs, are you going to like direct them to make it feces shaped? Or are you going to let them do it and then be like, oh, by the way?
No, they are tiny turds. And there'll be pop tents with examples of feces from the toad and the chicken.
That's cool. Yeah.
So they have references.
See, this is the first time in a long time that I felt really compelled to go to a kind of art making workshop because whenever I make anything with clay or any kind of material, it just looks like a turd anyway. So this is the first time I think I might actually be successful.
Hey.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so goofy, you know? And it'll be sweet. And then the library actually donated a bunch of the seeds, which I learned, which is really
the Rice
sweet.
University Library has a pretty extensive seed bank that they run.
Yeah, it's super cool. So they donated a bunch of the seeds tonight. So again, they're not doing that because they think I'm like cool, right? They're doing that because the project is interesting and compelling. I think that's a really important thing to name, is that people want to be part of it. We have a bunch of folks from the Native Seed Society, the Houston branch, that have come through and donated their private seeds and like been very excited about the project in general. And yeah, I think that's so lovely. Yeah,
it is. I kind of want to circle back. I'm, you know, as someone who's very interested in place and place-based work, I'm really curious. I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but you aren't from the Gulf Coast region. Okay, so. And I know that initially what drew you to the Gulf Coast was Herman. It was Herman Wallace, correct? Yeah, Herman Wallace, and the work that came out of your relationship with him. But I'm wondering what has kept you in the Gulf Coast region? What has kept you engaged with this region through all these different art pieces? And what does the Gulf Coast in particular provide for you?
I love this environment. I have fallen deeply in love with the swamps and the bayous of Louisiana. And that was really unexpected. I also just want to say thank you for asking that question. Because it's one of those unexpected loves. It wasn't love at first sight. I was afraid, you know. I grew up in the Northeast, and I didn't grow up in a particularly like outdoorsy family, you know, in a particularly outdoorsy place. And I was a jock in college, and so like of course I spent time outdoors, but it was like training, you know, Division I soccer player training. And then, you know, just like all of the different evolutions in my life, moving to Louisiana, or as my elders call it, Louisiana. And then like where do I find my sustenance? How do I sustain myself? And that was walks in the swamp. That was going to Jean Lafitte. That was going to Bayou Sauvage. That was going to City Park. That was seeing alligators again and again and again and again and not having them bite me. Like this like made up story about how vicious they are. And little by little, the swamp seduced me. And I often describe my experience as like, you know, I did not ever expect to be living in Louisiana for 20 years. I've been there 20 years. But it's a swamp, and it sucks you up when it wants you, and it spits you out when it's done. And so I'm waiting for that experience. And you know, I might die in New Orleans, Louisiana. That might be the place where I rest. And I'm okay with that. But I am in relationship to that place such that if she's done with me, I listen. Yeah, I know better.
That's really cool. I mean, I think that is pretty significant. And I grew up in Texas, and so I feel kind of similarly about Texas as a place. And Houston is not a place that initially I was excited to live, but I've lived here for 8 years now, I think. And it has really convinced me of itself in ways that I didn't expect. And sometimes those unexpected relationships with places, you know, some of the best ones that you can have.
Well, you guys got good restaurants.
That helps. The food helps, definitely.
Sure does.
All right. So, Jackie, Endangered Feces is now open. How long will it be on view? How can people come see it?
So it'll be on view until the sculptures break down.
Okay.
Which, you know, the hope is that they'll make it through a full year, a life cycle, and then just become part of the Harris Gully landscape. They are on the edge of the Harris Gully, as I described, but there's kind of like this gorgeous like giant oak tree that they're sitting under, and then the soccer fields are in front of it. I don't know the exact name of that, but very near the owl deck if you'd like to see them. And then if you'd like more information on the project itself, you can just go to the Moody Art Center website, and it'll talk about the kind of community that was built around this project, the different ways that you can engage with it and support these animals, and like other threads to chase if you so choose, if you find this work interesting. Yeah.
And it sounds like folks might want to come back at various times throughout the year and see how the project naturally devolves, I guess.
Devolves, yeah. I don't know. Evolves.
Yeah.
Where is it going? Do you have ideas for what's next in this line of work, or do you have ideas for what your next project is in general? I'll ask the unfair question of all artists, but
yeah, very unfair. I don't, and I do. I mean, the kind of like positive response that I've gotten from this has given me the courage to maybe push this inquiry a little further and see and explore what that looks like. There's been some thinking for me about making Endangered Feces somewhere between the 6-foot sculptures that we made together and these tiny seed bombs. So something that is like a little bit of that middle ground. Because if they are in our front yards, and if they are replicable, and if they are something that folks can use to activate these conversations, then I think they have even more power. Yeah.
Great.
I mean, I definitely put one in my yard. My neighbors might not like it, but I would do it.
Exactly. Too bad. You know, I did think that was going to be one of the experiences here. I thought there might be some students that are like, I'm paying this much money to go to school here. Why is there a big poop on the lawn? You know? But then within that protest, there's an important conversation to be had.
Oh yeah.
It's like, guess what was here before that lawn, you know? And so yeah, I do expect potential pushback, but I also have been grateful for the response so far. Yeah.
Oh, it's exciting work, and we're glad to have you on campus, and we're glad to have you in Houston, and hope to have more of your work here in the future.
Definitely.
Oh, thank you. It's been an honor and so great to be on the show, and I hope you guys keep going and keep like just having these conversations and doing the work, because we need each other.
Thanks so much, Jackie.
Yeah.
Jackie Sumell, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And for our next segment, we will hear from Stephanie Gray of AgriLife Extension Office in conversation with one of our student researchers, Newman Rinsendorge, about native and adapted plants.
For today's gardening segment, I'm joined by Stephanie Gray, a county extension agent in horticulture in Houston, Texas, working with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Today, Stephanie starts us off with a discussion on the importance of native and adapted plant species.
So I'm really excited to talk about native and adapted plants for Houston. A lot of people might already know this, or might kind of be new to ecology and landscaping. But Houston is home to like more than 10 diverse ecoregions. So we have coastal prairie, we have other types of ecosystems in our environment, and it's necessary to understand this because then you can start to understand what plants are adapted or native to our environment. So the big question is like, why do we care about native and adapted plants? Well, I would argue that just in the last year or two, our climate has shifted. So the USDA hardiness zone map, which kind of is the rule of thumb for all gardeners and farmers as to, their planting calendar and which plants are adapted to certain areas, has shifted tremendously in our region. So we now have less cold winters. So our freeze dates are pushed earlier and earlier back into the year with less severe freezes. We'll still have one or two cold snaps, but it's really, we're experiencing a different climate than we were, before. So with that, understanding the plants that have been native to this environment are able to adapt to a changing climate because they have sort of been established in our environment for so long that they understand the shifts in climate. They're able to adapt to really severe droughts. Some of them are able to adapt to cold snaps, and they're able to adapt to our really humid and hot summers. So focusing on planting native and adapted plants will really increase the resiliency of your landscape. So you'll have to replace plants far less. These native and adapted plants are widespread, so they're usually easy to find at a local nursery or greenhouse. And there's a lot of educational organizations around Houston kind of advocating for more use of these plants. So when we talk about native and adapted plants, we're talking about landscape plants. So we're talking about like vines and ground covers. We're talking about annuals and perennial plants, shrubs, trees, all of those kinds. And then when we talk about adapted plants, a lot of those same species, can be just sort of bred to have certain qualities that reduce their water intake needs, or will make sure that they are adapted to a really dry, hot summer. So kind of the difference between native and adapted plants is discussed a lot. There's some groups who think that, only natives should be planted. And there's other groups who say, hey, as long as the plant is adapted for our area, let's, support it and recommend it. So that's an interesting conversation as well. Homeowners and folks just have to make their own decisions when deciding what plants to plant. And I would say along the lines of adapted plants as well, if you're thinking more so for like edible plants and vegetable varieties, there are varieties that are adapted to our area. So we also have a recommended list of herbs and vegetables with specific varieties that can, again, withstand our really hot summers, that have either a shorter growing period, so you're able to complete a full harvest before the plant dies off in the heat of summer, or, just have different resiliencies. So it's important not only to look at native and adapted plants for ornamentals, but also vegetable varieties that have been adapted for our area. Other important aspects to touch on with native plants are the ecosystem services they provide. So they're home to a lot of pollinators, a lot of beneficial insects, and we need make sure that these insect populations are healthy and that they're well established, because then we can, support those food chains and make sure that we're reducing the use of our pesticides.
And so for our listeners out there, what are
Yeah.
some examples maybe of native and adaptive plants that our gardeners can use? And does it kind of depend on, I guess, the region that they live in Houston, or is it kind of just Houston wide?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I'll start off by saying, like, we have Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service has publications specifically for Harris County on native landscape plants and native and adapted plants for Houston. So a lot of these are, Texas wildflowers that we're familiar with in the annual category. Then when we go to perennials, there's a lot of, herbs that we recommend. There's like sages, and different types of flowers. And then for trees, there's a lot of native landscape trees that do well here. We're really familiar with the wax myrtles and the Yupon holly. A redbud tree is native and well adapted to our area. And then I'll give a little plug for the Harris County Master Gardener Association, because they kind of compiled these lists of native and adapted plants. Then there's another organization called the Native Plant Society of Texas, and they have a large, extensive list of recommended plants that are native to our area. And then it also, describes their growing heights and growing conditions, whether it's an evergreen, kind of the color, the water requirements, and the soil type. So like anything that you're planting in your landscape, you want to make sure that you assess your site before you choose which variety or which specific plant to establish there. So take into consideration how much sunlight it gets, what the drainage is, and what soil type you have, and then you can match up a native or adapted plant that will suit that location.
Sounds good.
A big thanks to Stephanie for being a guest on the show. You can learn more about her and AgriLife Extension's horticulture program at harris.agrilife, agrilife.org/hort, HORT. You can also learn more about Harris County Master Gardeners at txmg.org/HCMGA.
If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Sara Tabrez and Tara Varma. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French here on KPFT, Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.